Hi, I'm Bethan Ryder, Executive Editorial Director of WGSN. Welcome to our webinar today, Youth Attitudes Towards Sustainable Fashion. We're increasingly witnessing the result of climate change on our doorsteps, with extreme weather conditions from fires to floods, and so unsurprisingly, far from being an abstract concept, the threat posed by climate change feels extremely personal for the youth of today. A joint study by the UN's Development Programme and the University of Oxford, published in January 2021, found that 69% of teenagers globally believe climate change is an emergency. This eco-anxious cohort of climate activists want brands to show that they're interested in protecting their future by shifting to proactive environmental strategies. But they also follow trends and crave newness. So we'll talk today about how fashion brands can balance achieving ambitious climate goals while also catering to the youth consumers' desire for trends. So joining me to discuss these topics today, we have two WGSN experts. Lorna Hall, our Director of Fashion Intelligence. Hi Lorna, where are you zooming in from?
So I'm zooming in from London, sunny South London.
Great, and we also have Athena Chen, our Senior Strategist on Insight based in Shanghai. Hi Athena.
Hi Bethan, hi everyone.
And last but no means least, we have Gizem Arici, Sustainability Manager for Responsible Fashion Champions, Copenhagen Fashion Week. Hi Gizem.
Hi everyone.
So I just want to go back to something I touched upon in the introduction, and I think I'll come to you, Gizem, because Denmark and other Nordic countries are really known for leading the way with public policies in tackling the climate crisis. So at Copenhagen Fashion Week, what are you observing and how are brands striking this balance between lower impact behaviours, but while also catering to the youth market?
To start with, my impression is that the younger generations are on one hand very woke and informed and also outspoken when it comes to, as you mentioned, the climate crisis or other pressing topics such as social justice, and people really stand up for their values, beliefs and their communities, and I can feel activity just the urge to do something. On the other hand, though, I can also sense that there's this sentiment of potentially being overwhelmed and at times even frustration with policies, corporations, by the pace of how things are being changed and tackled. And there I can feel that younger generations might feel they are maybe too small of a piece in the puzzle to actually drive change on the scale needed. And turning this around for brands, I would say it's so relevant to pick up on this and to be honest and credible with what they communicate and also what they do. So to be very authentic in their work and to talk about what their issues are, what they're working on, and that of course they cannot tackle everything at the same time, but basically being very, just informative and clear about what it is they can actually do. And from my observations here in the Nordics, Copenhagen, but also the world more generally, I can definitely see that more and more brands are starting to be more open about their efforts regarding sustainability. And this can be connected to climate, but also to other topics. So there's definitely more and more information coming out, and also, just ensuring that information are valid and correct and not misleading in any kind of way.
Yes, that's certainly something at WGSN we've been writing a lot about, like transparency, and there's so many people calling people out now that you really can't hide behind a greenwash. Is becoming less and less of a possible thing you can get away with, which
exactly.
is good. I just want to come to Lorna now and talk a little bit about the sustainable mindset of consumers. What do you think, Lorna, is sort of the biggest priority right now when people are, particularly the youth market, Gen Z, millennials, when they're making a purchasing decision today in fashion? What are you seeing?
Well, I suppose we're very lucky at WGSN in that we actually have access to data, because we have our own proprietary consumer data tool, which panels 550 consumers a day. And these people share their views with us. And one of the questions that we ask them around fashion and fashion purchasing is around ethics, and what matters are important to them when they come to purchase a garment. And the environment comes up very, very clearly with the 18 to 24-year-old segment, the Gen Z segment. In the UK, we're pretty much at almost sort of 40% of 15 to 24-year-olds saying that the environment is very important to them when they're considering which brand or why they would purchase a particular a garment. And that's something that stayed fairly steady for that generation. In the US, it's very much more behind the UK market. But what we've seen really recently, and particularly over the last year post-COVID in the data, is that the US is growing quite rapidly. So we've seen a 12% year-on-year increase in the environment figuring in 18 to 24-year-old US fashion purchasers. So the environment is the key indicator of several when we ask people what of these 5 or 6 issues are important to you when purchasing a fashion garment.
And over the pandemic, have other things come to the fore as well? Things like workers' rights, safe and equitable working conditions, because obviously we talk a lot about plastic consumption and reducing carbon emissions when we talk about kind of responsible fashion, but we know it goes beyond that, right? It goes to how workers are treated. And so is that kind of also rising as a concern?
Interestingly, we have seen over the last year at particular times, some of these measures sort of wax and wane or become more important and then become less important. And I think you can take 2 things from this. I'll give you a couple of examples. Last year in the US particularly, but in the UK as well, we saw the inclusivity measure really come up highly, particularly driven, of course, all of the issues and challenges and debate following the murder of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. So inclusivity obviously became a really important issue. And we saw that very strongly in the data around what mattered to people purchasing fashions, or from a brand consideration point of view, that brands were more inclusive. And similarly, we saw different drivers such as ethics around ethical trading, basically, ethical trading practices. And we saw that rate suddenly very high above the environment for a certain period last year, when it became very obvious and very transparent that a lot of brands and retailers had cancelled enormous amounts of fashion garment orders to in the global supply chain, and that was directly impacting garment workers. With wages and the whole pay up campaign that came up as a response to that, obviously really figured in a lot of news feeds on social media, and we really saw the workers' rights in the supply chain figuring quite strongly in that data around that time. And as I say, those have fluctuated with Gen Z, but they were very much strong at that point. I think the important thing to take about that is they may not figure consistently in the way the environment does for the youth demographic, but that sort of spike, what it's done is it's raised awareness. And so it leaves that awareness with that customer, the sort of awareness they didn't have before. And I think that's what's most important about those spikes, is the way they change the narrative and they create a new awareness in that customer group that didn't exist, and what that new awareness means for fashion purchasing in the future. So although this sort of tracks really interesting buzz, it's those spikes that actually create new areas that have new challenges for the industry that, rightly should be responded to and worked on.
Great. Well, that brings us nicely on to a question I've got here for Athena, which is who's our representative based in Shanghai. So the APAC region, Athena, is often where a lot of brands are doing their manufacturing, but it's also a place where a lot of people look for the pioneering trends. It's a very trend leading region with youth. So I wondered what you can tell us you're seeing in your region, really, from a brand design perspective, but also attitudes there from the Gen Z youth market.
Yeah, definitely. I think the issue of sustainability here in APAC is definitely very pressing, because for a lot of, people, whether they're based in China or Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Philippines, these are all big fashion production hubs. And, local consumers and also governments are now paying a lot more attention to the environmental impact of fashion. And, we're definitely seeing a lot more transparency being demanded from, whether it's brands that are producing here or, how they're selling fashion globally. So we've been seeing a lot of global brands producing in China or Southeast Asia, beginning to publish lists of, the facilities they use and really being, more transparent around their supply chains. And I also, what I find really interesting is also how young designers face in the region, because they're so close to manufacturers and they're so close to the supply chain. They have this opportunity to really understand how to close the loop. So, for example, Shanghai Fashion Week, similarly to Copenhagen Fashion Week, has really been putting sustainability high on the agenda. And they have been organizing events and workshops for local emerging designers in China and the broader APAC region to really connect with green manufacturers in China, and also, conducting workshops and educating them on how to design sustainability and integrate all of that green manufacturing into their value chains and supply chains. And what I also find very interesting is, on a smaller scale, because a lot of textile manufacturing happens in Asia, there is a lot of leftover fabrics and dead stock that is available at hand. And we're really seeing a lot of young emerging designers, working with upcycled fabrics, and really, using these rich resources of secondhand clothing to create, creative designs. And another really interesting thing is the rise of, localism that has happened since the pandemic. And from this, what we're seeing is, government and also nonprofit organizations coming together to promote traditional crafts and also, locally sourced organic materials. So I think this is also something that's, on the rise, and we're seeing younger designers embrace these local textile craftsmanships and locally sourced organic materials in place of synthetic fabrics, and really kind of transforming, their local culture and this kind of like organic sense of fashion into more contemporary identities and into everyday wear. So I think that's something that I find really uplifting and quite, happy to see that emerging across Asia.
Yeah, that's a positive side. That's brilliant. Is that, Gizem, something that, what's happening from your point of view at Copenhagen? How are you using your platform to drive this change too with lower impact fashion? Are you doing some of the things that they're doing at Shanghai? What kind of initiatives have you worked through?
Yeah, so in Copenhagen, we launched our Sustainability Action Plan in January 2020, which is now 1.5 years ago, but time is flying. And in this action plan, we are focusing on basically two aspects, one of them being our own event and our organization in itself, where we are aiming to reduce our impacts and innovate. And this is mainly through partnerships. And the second pillar is focusing on the industry and the acceleration of sustainability efforts in especially the Danish industry, as we are located in Copenhagen. And within the second pillar of the action plan, we put forward our 2023 sustainability requirements, where we basically demand our brands to live up to a set of 18 minimum standards and a minimum score they have to achieve in order to participate on the official schedule of Fashion Week as of January 2023. And these standards, they are covering the whole value chain perspective. So we really tried to be as holistic as possible when we were putting those forward. So the focus areas here are strategy, design, materials, working conditions, but also consumer engagement. And lastly, the show production, which is of course very particular to us as an event. So there we focus on reducing plastic waste, for instance, or again, the climate impact that a show can have. And what we've done so far is that we have conducted a pilot study with a selection of brands where they had the chance to run through this tool and all the questions we have for them in order to participate in a year of 1.5 years of time at Fashion Week. And what we've been hearing is that they find it very helpful. As I said, it's very extensive and broad, and they can really go through all areas of their business and figure out, oh, is there any area that we are maybe not as strong as in another? Are there maybe some points that we've been missing out completely and didn't have in our mind when we were, for instance, working on our sustainability strategy? And so this has been a way for us to really push the industry in a certain direction, which felt very bold and still does. But on the other hand, the feedback has been really positive and encouraging to actually change some parts of businesses and how, basically their day-to-day activities are being conducted.
So I want to talk a little bit about, obviously we've got this incredibly eco-anxious cohort, which are thinking about all these issues, but they also love social media. And there's nothing that social media needs more than newness. So I just wanted to sort of come to you, maybe Athena, on this one, and sort of how is that being balanced by this sort of group, that Gen Z and millennials? How are they coping with these this dichotomy, I guess?
Yes, definitely. That's a very interesting kind of like conundrum that we're currently in. But I think what I find really interesting is because like a lot of, fast fashion that is being produced nowadays is more or less kind of, they're kind of really ubiquitous and they look pretty much the same. So we're actually seeing a lot of these Gen Z and millennial youth, looking to secondhand concepts, to kind of find the uniqueness that these kind of manufactured items cannot provide. So they're looking for, they're hunting for unique items on social media, on e-commerce, on re-commerce platforms. And, these kids are really priding themselves in the knowledge of, fashion history and, the garments, and really going to great lengths to procure these, vintage items or rare items. So I really think this is also driving young consumers to completely rethink the idea of traditional ownership in clothes. So I think for the younger Gen Z and millennials, what they're really liking to ask is this item resellable? Is it reusable? Is it recyclable? To really add, additional value to the items that they're buying. And that also helps them, generate a sense of newness. And what we're really seeing is kind of like the DIY fashion trend that is thriving on, platforms that are popular among youth consumers, such as TikTok and Depop. We're really seeing, a lot of young consumers now teaching other viewers how to bring new life to old clothes instead of throwing them away. So a great account is Vintage Stock Reserve. So this account shares upcycling and sewing tutorials to more than over 1 million followers. So we're really seeing sustainability credentials now kind of becoming a badge of honor for these young kids. Visible mending or visible repairs are bringing this unique touch to items and help them kind of like show off on social media as well. So I definitely think this kind of actually goes hand in hand and, creating newness and kind of like bring creativity to old clothes and vintage clothing, and also being able to create social content. And another point I would like to add is also precisely because these young kids are socializing in these digital spaces, this is driving the rise of the metaverse, which is, this ultimate convergence of digital and physical reality that WGSN has been tracking and reporting on. So digital fashion items are also coming into the forefront. And this is really, holding great potential for brands to enter the space and create digital collections that can cut waste, reduce costs, but also meet this kind of consumer demand for newness. We've been seeing brands designing digital sneakers that can be digitally worn through AR apps or, in online games. And I think this is really, coming across for brands to really showcase creativity and also engage consumers in co-creation. But I do think, realistically speaking, we do have a set of consumers that are a bit more passive. And these consumers are more interested in the idea of sustainability that is being led by brands. So according to the Edelman Trust Barometer report published in 2021, the majority of consumers expect companies and business leaders to address and solve environmental challenges. So I think this also gives brands an opportunity to establish themselves as thought leaders in this space and really guide these young kids that are kind of like forming their ideas about sustainability and a sustainable future, and really bring the brand together with young consumers in creating a sustainable culture and future.
Actually, that's interesting. Gizem, are any of your brands at Copenhagen that show at Copenhagen Fashion Week kind of bringing in archive items and sort of going back over their collections and sort of feeding into this thirst for sort of Y2K and fashion from, retro fashion, if you like? I just want to throw that question in there.
Yeah, of course. So, for instance, this year, the opening brand of the Spring Summer Edition 22 will be Division. And for instance, they are offering a deconstruct line where they utilize used garments and textiles more broadly, which are then reworked to give them a new life and then are sold as part of their brand. So there's definitely this hunt for materials that haven't been in use before. And I also see that definitely like dead stock and leftover fabrics is a big thing, not only within brands, but also at the Royal Danish Academy here, where we have a lot of design students. And I feel that has been a common red thread for the past couple of years, where you see that especially younger people and younger mindsets, they want to create out of waste and out of materials that are already existing. What I also can see is that there's a new view or touch on working with more traditional craftsmanship and connecting to skills that may seem old-fashioned, but so valuable in any time that we live in. And there we, for instance, have our talent slot, Arøgehøve, and my Danish pronunciation is really, really bad, so I'm excusing if this is not pronounced on point. Their brand is working with traditional knitwear techniques and really trying to experiment with those in a more intuitive way. And their main aim is also to see how garments react to different bodies and how different body shapes can also shape a garment in another way. So that's also a very interesting approach to think about body inclusivity, and that one garment doesn't have to look the same on every person, which is also great when you share things, for instance, with friends or family.
That's brilliant. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the aesthetics. I'm going to come to Lorna because I know that we've talked quite a lot at WGSN about the kind of make, do and mend, if you like. But what are you seeing played out with aesthetics in the fashion space that's connected to all of this sort of upcycling and these sorts of things?
Yeah, I think Gizem's example is really interesting because beyond upcycling, which we're seeing a lot of at the moment, and it's exactly as Athena said, it's absolutely of the now. It's got that ingeniosity that Gen Z love. They love to revere somebody doing something new with something that already exists, right? TikTok that's the whole premise in some ways of that social platform. And that's what I find great about, that when they apply it to fashion and they remake garments or they show you how to do something with something older. But I think beyond that we're seeing just aesthetics in fashion, and fashion as a visual language literally reinventing itself. And that is the most exciting thing about this whole shift that Gizem is talking about. So whether it be the sole on a trainer and the way that looks, because it is made up of entirely recycled materials. So, you know, the texture of that goes from being something smooth and uniform to being something grainy and textured. That's a new visual aesthetic, and we're seeing that recycled materiality aesthetic starting to really become a huge part of fashion vernacular. And when you first look at it, it does look really odd. And, you know, it will become very familiar to us. It's a new visual language, and sustainability and lower impact materials and more responsible making, all these approaches are creating a whole new aesthetic for fashion. And that's why, if you're a designer, it is incredibly exciting period. Just in general practice, such as print, if you think about when you're making a new garment and you think about zero waste techniques and how that affects the old way of making a printed garment, in terms of making sure that a print matches, you know, when you put it together, you know, you don't have odd juxtaposition of print. Well, the big question is why? Why is that a bad thing? And how to make, and you break that old aesthetic rule now because you're much more focused on zero waste. And that creates a whole new aesthetic, which is that prints don't match in the same way that they used to. And this is what's absolutely fascinating about a whole new design process, that it changes the visual language entirely. And, you know, that's I think, from an old school point of view, it's like we're watching some fashion shed a skin and develop a new one.
Do you have some other examples like this, Gizem, that you're seeing from brands that are moving towards sort of responsible retail that show at Copenhagen Fashion Week that you sort of want to talk about in this space?
I would say it's definitely more smaller labels and brands. Some of them might not be showing because a lot of the brands here in Copenhagen can be one-man shows or two people working on everything. So yeah, it's definitely a broad mix. And just looking into the community here, there's always a discussion around the aesthetics. Why do things have to look a certain way and cannot look another way? And how can we merge with art and even architecture? So it's becoming such a broad thing because sustainability is basically everywhere. It's in the food, it's in how buildings are built, it's cycling around the city, and you get so many impressions that can spark creativity. So I think there's just this really urge to bring together all of the sensations that we take in to garments and how we look and how we express ourselves. So that's really exciting. And when I look at, let's say, the bigger brands that we have here, I would say there's more focus on than business models or using more responsible materials or new materials and investing in technologies. So the approach is a bit different. It's less experimental. It's on a larger scale, but again, looking into how can we reduce our waste? How can we use our leftover fabrics? How can we make sure to maybe resell them? How can, more tapping into the business model in itself. So it's a bit of a twofold approach.
Yeah. I mean, that is always a big issue. We had the founder of Milo on the podcast, and this you have all these fantastic materials that are coming through, but scaling them up seems to be for the bigger brands is the big issue, right? The cost of that, and how we can sort of take that to a mass level.
Yeah, it is big. It is a big challenge, but we are seeing brands take it on. I was reading the other day about CNA in Europe and them bringing, setting up a big manufacturing plant back in Mönchengladbach, and where they're going to start denim manufacturing and really pushing for the best low impact methods they can get within that facility. And they really hope by 2022 that they'll be pushing out sort of 400,000 items. So that's at scale, making a big reduction with a hope that they can get that to 800,000 items in the future. So, that if they can clean up their processes and put units out that are sort of at a commercial level for their business, then that will improve the impact on their sort of overall, responsible retailing targets. So we are seeing lots of brands try and scale up that challenge and tackle it. And so there is a lot of hope for the future, I think, but it's going to take time, obviously.
I completely agree with what has been said, but I do think brands should also really think about just starting small. It doesn't have to be, this huge revamp of their whole supply chain and value chain, but really looking at starting small and really building outwards. So I recently read where the Fashion Circular program at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation says the group has been working with denim brands to generate circularity about really focusing on a few products and getting them right, and then being able to progressively roll out to other products on a larger scale. So I really think it's about zooming in and looking at the small bits that you can, tweak first and then thinking about scaling up. So I do think there is still an opportunity there.
We talked a lot about greenwashing, which I think we're moving away from because people are more and more aware of it. And I wondered, this sort of Gen Z, millennials, they're no fools. They're they're very skeptical of brand messaging. So I wondered, maybe if I come to you, Athena, what advice you'd give to brands who want to be more transparent about their efforts, but they're sort of terrified of the cancel culture that we have.
Yeah, definitely. I think, thinking about transparency and cancel culture, I think for brands, the crucial thing is really to be transparent. I think brands really need to kind of keep in mind that, owning up to what they're currently doing and what still needs to be done will definitely win with consumers. So, not making really kind of unrealistic claims, because these Gen Z and millennial youth are so much more savvier about these subjects. So definitely, I think, we've been seeing success from certain brands that, are stating that, they failed in certain aspects, or, encouraging people to not buy their brands, actually, having that effect of boosting their popularity. So I definitely think, brands need to be transparent and really share their achievements and share what they've been striving to done, but also really own up to the shortcomings.
I think it's really interesting when you compare what Athena's saying to what our data says when we ask that what's important to you. We're really seeing transparency as a measure come up quite strongly, and I think that is the response. We've got a consumer, both the youth consumer, the 18 to 24-year-old Gen Z, and millennials, both saying in the UK and US, there's been a 14% year-on-year increase from millennials around transparency being really important. So that is people that are saying, we understand that no one is perfect. We want you to be utterly transparent about where you're at and what you're doing and what's changing. And with Generation Z, it's sort of 18% of them are looking for that transparency. So very important that, yes, take people on the journey you're on, as Athena says, and be utterly open about where you're at on all of these issues.
Exactly right. I think we haven't got a huge amount of time. I'm going to throw you a couple more questions. There's always a discussion of is sustainability and that sort of thinking of that when you're purchasing. Is it just for people with money? How are we making this accessible to a younger generation? I wonder if, Gizem, if you've got anything you want to say about that in terms of how brands are making this more accessible to the younger generation.
Yeah, I think that is such an interesting topic, and also something that, for instance, I would discuss a lot with, for instance, friends who would say, oh, I think the CNA example was great for this, because CNA is massive and they sell a lot of products. So a lot of people would think I might refrain from going there because it's maybe not produced as nicely as I would want it to be, or are they really as sustainable as they claim to be? What do they actually do? But then if you look deeper into it, you actually see that there's a lot of work put into it. because especially the bigger ones, they know they have to act. There's no way that they can just lay back and let smaller independent labels do the work, because that's not where the large scale change will come from. And I think this is also where we have this striking the balance between having sustainability accessible for the mass market, because as you mentioned, not everyone has huge amounts of money to spend on garments all the time. So it's definitely important to have accessibility and affordability, which can be driven by larger brands, corporations even. But then when you look at more contemporary and designer brands, I think what we can see is also trying to tap into more affordability. And this can be through, I think, resale models or rental models where you don't necessarily have to own something for a long period of time, which is occasion wear. And with the resale platforms, I think it has been picked up vastly in the past couple of years, which is on one hand great if you want to sell garments, so you actually get some monetary value back from something that you might not want anymore. For instance, Soland, they have recently launched a resale platform together with Create to Stay, and here they buy back pre-owned garments and resell them on their website, which is value for everyone involved in that process, and that is awesome. And on the other hand, I would say it's also a lot about, for instance, samples, which have been sometimes just, no one knew what happens with the samples. So we know that there have been many of them. Now a lot of these processes are digitized, which is amazing. But then looking at those, I feel there's more and more interest in maybe repurposing those or offering them at smaller price points. So again, it becomes more accessible to a wider audience.
Brilliant. Okay, I want to just ask you all, apart from Copenhagen Fashion Week, WGSN, and some of the brands we've discussed, who else is really educating people here? Maybe I could go to all of you for that one. So Lorna, in your who are you thinking is sort of really educating the public and consumers?
Well, in terms of internally for brands, if I were to flip that a little bit on its head, internally, I would say that it's worth bigger businesses making the most of the activists in their midst. And by that, I mean the people who work for you already. We've certainly benefited from that at WGSN. You know that very well, Bethan. We have a sustainability board, and I always refer to them as the activists in our midst. And they effectively advise us, they push us on our KPIs around our content around sustainability. And it's a very effective way of keeping the organisation moving forward, and also drawing other people in as these initiatives get going. So I would always say, look at home first. What have you got at home? Because that can make a great difference. And it also really helps you because these, as we all know, this is not easy stuff. You're changing all your processes. So you need as many internal champions as possible to help you get there.
Gizem, who are you sort of looking to? I know there's lots of organizations you work with.
Yeah, as I think we talked about transparency a lot during this session, I would like to bring up some organizations that work with transparency in particular. And there, what came to my mind is definitely Fashion Revolution, who has been really raising awareness in the past couple of years on more the social side of where are my garments made, who is responsible for them, which I think was a great success, especially for younger generations who've been eye-opened to these topics through their campaigns. And another account that I personally like to follow is called Entry Level Activist. And there it's really about this activist language and how to unpack it and how activism can be accessible for everyone and so inclusive that every step counts. And a lot of times also really explaining some terms that might be flying around, which seem very abstract. So really helping to inform and engage with their followers, basically.
Athena, have you got anything to add to this?
I do think like for brands that are probably operating in multiple markets, I think with the trend of localism that I mentioned earlier, I think it's really worth brands doing more social listening and research online to understand sustainable initiatives and leading activists and creatives locally to really resonate with the regional market they operate in. So for example, when APAC or when APAC Gen Z talk about sustainability, they're really more likely to be thinking about kind of issues at hand, such as pollution, city waste, and food safety that might be opposed to kind of like, other issues that Western markets, Gen Z and Western markets are more concerned about. So I really think it's thinking in terms of like zooming in and not thinking a one size would probably fit all kind of mindset and learning about sustainability.
I'm just going to wrap up then. Thank you everybody for watching, and thank you for your time, Gizem, Lorna and Athena. If you're a WGSN subscriber, you'll find plenty more reports on the site discussing all of these topics, and also look out for our October white paper, which is tackling sustainability and has lots of advice for all the industries we serve, from food to fashion. And that's produced in partnership with Copenhagen Fashion Week. So also you can visit the Copenhagen Fashion Week website for more information about the ways the platform is incorporating sustainability in their own organisation, but also on an industry level. So look those websites up, and thank you everybody for watching.